So in the A series, though, I don't want to get too much into all the intellectual debates. I just want you to think about the ideas, and I want to think about how you can apply them in your life. So in this series, so the T series, and so I call it the T series because it's the theory series. So it's really looking at, in a sense, the theoretical debates that that surround the ideas that I'm presenting in this course. And so here I'm going to be talking about where some of these ideas come from. I'm going to be talking about how these ideas are part of debates against other ideas. And so if you watch these talks, you can get a sense of what kinds of debates and intellectual arguments these ideas are part of, and you can also become part of these debates and intellectual arguments. And so for each, in a sense, there's almost, for each A series video, or for a few of each A series videos, there's the corresponding T series video. And so this is the first one, and actually there is no corresponding A series video. For this one, it's really, so I'm calling it the intellectual foundations of the new Mindscape. So the intellectual foundations of this course. So let me see here. So let me just put it on play. So do you guys see my face right now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And so now you see my slide?
Yeah, sorry, I just kind of interrupt because I heard that there's a kind of background noise.
Yeah, well, we can't do anything about it. There's construction going on around my house, and no matter where I am, there's going to be this noise. So is it really loud?
It's not really loud, but it just keeps me wondering what's that noise.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we can't do anything about it. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, so for everybody who's watching, also there's construction going on outside my house, so I apologize for the noise, and I hope that you can still follow this talk. So this is a course. So basically the intellectual approach of this course is, I will call it, it's a practical and socially engaged approach to spirituality, which is grounded in critical anthropological and sociological knowledge. So in this talk, I'm going to be talking about what does it mean to have a practical and socially engaged approach to spirituality, which is critically grounded in critical anthropological and sociological knowledge. So we're going to be learning and talking about spirituality. Now, it makes a difference where you are socially located. What is the place in society in which you are learning about spirituality and perhaps practicing spirituality? And so in today's urban modern society, we could say that there are three such major locations. So one is non-institutional spiritual networks, another one is institutional religion, and a third one is academia. So nowadays, usually, or very often when people talk about spirituality, they kind of associate it with something like, it's like spiritual, but not religious. Yes, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. I take part in spiritual practices, but I'm not a member of a religion. And so, and there are a lot of groups that engage in, let's say, meditation or body, mind, spirit, the new age, alternative spiritualities, alternative healing. So there's this whole world of people outside of organized religion and outside of academia who are really engaging in different kinds of spiritual practices and in discourses on spirituality. Now, this social space is a very free space because it's actually outside of any institutional religion, and it's also outside of academic institutions. So in that space, you're actually free pretty much to do whatever you want. And actually that's a very good thing because there's a lot of space for creativity, for originality, for doing new things. You know, there's no restrictions in there. So in this sense, that kind of non-institutional spiritual networks you know, it's a space for innovation and creativity to take place. But there's a problem there also, which is that, first of all, because it's a non-institutional space, so there are no rigorous systems for critically assessing the type of knowledge that is being used. So anything goes, so you can just do whatever you want, and that's great, that's very free, but there's not going to be a lot of systematic, there's no filtering of the knowledge that is being generated or that's being used in that space. Um, right. There's no critical, I mean, there can be critical reflection, but there's no systematic way of assessing whether the knowledge and no systematic way of assessing the knowledge and the practices. So this is one problem in that space. And the other problem in that space is that it's a commercialized space because people have no institutional support. So those who really devote themselves to it full time, well, they have no choice but to do it as entrepreneurs. So everybody has their own, is offering their own spiritual services, you know, kind of health services, um, personal coaching services, spiritual therapy services, and this and that. And people are, so they're packaging it in a kind of a commercial fashion. And so this leads to, it leads to privileging whatever methods and ideas that are marketable. And it also leads to shaping those methods and ideas in ways that are marketable packages. So that's the issue that we have in the non-institutional spiritual networks. And that really, in a sense, you know, I don't want to say that what's going on there is bad. There's a lot of great things going on in that space. But in a sense, much of the discourse on spirituality in the world today is somewhat distorted because it comes out of this non-institutional, highly commercialized entrepreneurial space. So this is one space. And then the other space is institutional religion. And actually, the institutional religion space is very important for spirituality. Although nowadays there's, right, in many places, there's this dichotomy that people say, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. So spirituality is, and sometimes even understood as being anti-religious. Um, but in a sense, though, most of the ideas, most spiritual ideas and spiritual practices, they actually come from religion. And so, in a sense, the non-institutional space is kind of picking the fruits from religion and eating them and consuming them. But the tree is actually in religion. And so you can't really run away from religion and just eat eat the spiritual fruit and enjoy it. At some point, you have to deal with the religious roots of most of these practices and most of these ideas. So religion is very, very important. It's fundamental in the uh, in any exploration of spiritual ideas and spiritual practices. Now, the problem, though, is that um, in the institutional religious space, each religion has its own set of ideas and practices, you know, um, and it um, and it promotes only its own set of ideas and practices. And also, that's not a bad thing because each religion wants to have its own consistency and coherence between its ideas and its practices. But what that means is that if you want to explore and investigate spiritual ideas and practices, if you go in only one religious institution, well, you'll only get one approach or one perspective. So that's the first problem that we have in the institutional religious space. Um, and then we will also, in some of the institutional religious space, even deal with the issue of sectarianism. So not only is only one approach, there's a focus on only one approach, but in some of the institutional religious spaces, there's even actually really exclusion of other approaches, and so discouraging, actually, to encourage, discouraging the exploration of different ideas and approaches. And so that's why there's a limitation in the institutional religious space. So the institutional religious space is very important because at one level, to have consistency, systematic, and to go in depth, actually, I don't think it's possible to avoid religion. But within an institutional religious space, it's going to be hard to have a broad view where you're going to be able to examine with an open mind different spiritual ideas and practices. So that's the problem in the institutional religious space. Now, then the third space is the academic space. So in the academic space, and so that's where we are, and that's where I am. And so I'm speaking, and in this course, we're speaking from within an academic space. Now, the academic space is different from the non-institutional spiritual network space because it's not a commercial space. And it has, in a sense, in common with the non-institutional spiritual space, it has the common of it wants to be open-minded and wants to be ready to investigate anything. But it's not a entrepreneurial commercial space. But it has a critical approach that is lacking in the non-institutional spiritual networks space. Now, it shares with the institutional religious space, it shares a desire to have rigor and focus. It has traditions of knowledge that need to be respected. It has mechanisms for assessing the validity of knowledge claims. So in a sense, in that way, the academic space is similar to the institutional religious space. But the academic space is an open one. It is not committed to a single religion. It's a secular space. So the secular nature of the academic space is both a positive and a negative in the approach in this space. It's a positive because it's not committed to any religion, and it actually allows the participants to not be to learn without being committed to any of these ideas or these practices. So in that sense, the secular nature of the academic space is a very positive one. So it's secular, it's critical, it's non-commercial. So all of these are positive. But the problem in the academic space is that it completely separates theory and practice. So the secular nature of it makes it difficult to really directly and positively engage with some of these spiritual ideas and practices. But this is where I'm going to be pushing the envelope and pushing the boundaries in this course to see to what extent in the academic space we are able to positively and critically engage with spiritual ideas and practices. So that's just to say where we are located when we hear in this course, when we engage in this discourse and practices on spirituality. Now then, to look a little deeper into the academic locations. So we're in an academic space, but in the academic space, there are many different locations. And different locations where actually people do talk about and do research on spiritual ideas and practices. And so the first one is what I would call the applied fields. And so we have, for example, in social work and nursing and even in medicine. So these are fields where people are in their research, they deal with people who are suffering from illnesses, people who are in end of life care, who are dealing with trauma, who are in various forms of marginality and so on. And so in these practical fields, the practitioners are actually realizing that spiritual approaches can be very useful. They can be very beneficial. So for example, if I'm in social work and I'm dealing with end of life care, well, then actually I should actually bringing spiritual approaches to helping people deal with end of life is very good. And so I'm going to be doing research on that, and looking at how spiritual approaches might be useful. Or mindfulness, if we want to help people to be relaxed and see how that can work at school, how that can work at the workplace, so we can engage in research on mindfulness practices. Um, in nursing, how to deal with suffering. So in all of these applied fields, we see more and more research is taking place on spirituality and on the application of different spiritual techniques. And this is very good, but a problem with it, now I'm speaking as an anthropologist here, so a problem with it though, is that in these applied fields, again, it's taking some fruit from the spiritual tree, so to speak, and then slotting how can something be used, how can a spiritual practice be instrumentally be used within to deal with a narrow problem, like end of life. So actually everything else, no spirituality, but end of life, we need spirituality. So we're going to use it there. So the overall structure is not at all, we could say materialist, but there's some areas where we need a bit of spirituality. So we'll research it and inject a little bit into that particular applied field. So in a sense, there's no general critical perspective. It's really about applying in that narrow field. So that's the issue in the applied fields. Now then, some of the other academic fields are what I would call the positivist fields. And for example, we could say in psychology and neuroscience. So there we're really looking at, and there's more and more research which is being done, which is, for example, what are the psychological effects or even the neurological effects of certain spiritual practices or certain spiritual attitudes. And then we can measure that, that research is done. Those effects can be measured. And then based on the results of that research, then we can know to what extent, let's say, psychological, spiritual practices, let's say again, often is meditation or even prayer, to what extent might that be, how could it be used in a beneficial way? But so again, I think this is very good. But from a critical perspective, the problem here, there are two problems, is that the research focuses on the material effects. So it does not want to examine what are the underlying ontological assumptions behind those practices. And I'll talk more about that later. And secondly, the focus is very narrow on the individual. So there's no critique of the social conditions that within which these practices are embedded, and within which psychological research and intervention is taking place. So we have a very narrow individualist understanding of the person and of spiritual practices when we're in these positivist fields of psychology and neuroscience. So then the other field is the critical fields. And so this is the one where I position myself. And this is the one where, in a sense, this course then takes place. And this includes academic philosophy, and it also includes anthropology and sociology. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about academic philosophy, although it's extremely important. Philosophy asks the fundamental questions. But the problem in academic philosophy is that it's completely disembodied, completely theoretical and disembodied. So academic philosophy has lost what existed when philosophy began in Greece. When we talked about the love of wisdom, it was not simply an intellectual exercise. It was actually how to live your life with wisdom. And that involved so it was not intellectual, a purely intellectual exercise of the mind. It was about how do you use your mind to live your life? And also the body was involved as well. And this is also the case in Chinese philosophy. So in a sense, academic philosophy deals with and has, in a sense, it's essential. It's essential, and we will deal with some ideas of academic philosophy. But the severe limitation of academic philosophy is that it is completely disembodied. Completely, it has become a purely intellectual exercise, and separated from practice. So, okay. So again, philosophy is great, really important. But so what we're looking at it here, and the contribution that we want to bring then, is from the critical field of anthropology and sociology. But now, the approach that I propose here is very different. So it is rooted in the critical tradition in anthropology and sociology. But the approach is very different from, I'd say, anything you will see in anthropology and sociology. Because what I'm proposing to do here is to use spirituality as method in the critical social sciences. So what we see in anthropology and sociology is people study, they might take spirituality as an object of study. In other words, there are people out there in society who practice spirituality, or who claim to practice spirituality. There are these people who do, they pray, they meditate, they try to make themselves better, they take care of themselves, they're engaged in religious communities. And so I study that group of people. I describe them, I understand their structure, I try to understand the logic of it and everything like that. But I'm looking at them doing that. I'm not doing any of that at all. There's nothing in their practices, their spiritual practice, that could help me in my research methodology. They're doing that, and I'm using completely different mental capacities to observe and to study them. So that's spirituality as an object of study. But I'm going to argue here that spirituality is fundamental to the method of study in anthropology and sociology. And in fact, this course is an experiment in that. I could say it's just only the beginning of trying to elaborate this. And so what I'm going to talk about now are only some very preliminary ideas, and they are not yet fully mature. So I'm going to talk first about the anthropological tradition and then the sociological tradition. So in the anthropological tradition, so let's look a little bit at the history of anthropology here. So let's look at, in the 19th century, the late 19th century and the early 20th century, when anthropology starts to be born as an academic discipline. And so anthropology comes into being as an academic discipline to study the origins of humanity and to study the primitive human beings. So as the European powers engage in the colonization of the rest of the world, they discover that there are many different societies and many different cultures who are different from the modern industrial West. And so anthropology then comes into being as a discipline which is trying to get the holistic picture of humanity, including the primitive, so to speak, people, and then discovering the kinds of their culture, their lifestyle, their way of being, and so on. And so an example of this was Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, one of the earliest French anthropologists, and he wrote several books on what he called the primitive mentality. And so there's a dichotomy which is made between the rational modern mentality and a primitive, non-rational, even irrational or non-logical type of mentality. So Lévy-Bruhl kind of makes this distinction between these two ways of thinking. And so the distinction is that, well, the modern human being doesn't have that. The modern human is rational, and the non-modern, the pre-modern human has this a completely different mind, and it is called mystic participation and things like that. So we start with this kind of dichotomy. Now, then by the 1950s, we have anthropology moving forward, and a good example of that is Claude Lévi-Strauss, and he had his book, The Savage Mind. And in many ways, he kind of builds on that dichotomy that was widespread in Western societies and widespread in anthropology. But there's a difference there because he said, okay, we have the savage mind, and that's contrasted to the so-called civilized mind. But he says that actually these two different kinds of minds, all humans have them. And so then he starts to discover how there are very, very sophisticated systems of knowledge that exist in the so-called savage mind. And we all have that. So so we could say with Lévi-Brühl, the spiritual, broadly spoken, was seen as something as backward and primitive. Then under Lévi-Strauss, it's now something that is equal. In a sense, we all have it, and it's more positively valued, and it's rational. And this reflects the evolution of anthropology that starts to question the racism of its origins and starts to valorize the societies that it is studying, and to valorize them increasingly. And so then if we skip to the current, modern or present day anthropology, we have, for example, Lévi-Strauss's disciple, Philippe Descola, and who brings in really is one of the key figures to usher in the so-called ontological turn in anthropology, where now it's not just about studying the beliefs or the systems of representations of other cultures, but it's actually really trying to understand how do different cultures understand the way the world is made? What are the basic constituents of the world? And Descola, he makes a typology of different ontologies, and naturalism, which is the modern ontology, which so naturalism, which is the modern ontology, is only one among a number of other ontologies, including animism, analogism, and totemism, which in Descola's scheme each of them are as logical and rational as each other, and they are all valid as each other, and they all have deep intellectual insights to give us. So we enter a period where we are now in a period of ontological pluralism. So the non-Western, the non-secular cultures and people in those cultures in the ontological turn in anthropology become our intellectual partners. So the idea is that studying the ontologies and studying the way in different cultures the universe is understood, the cosmos is understood. These aren't simply beliefs that you describe, but they're actually ideas that we should engage in. We should engage with these ideas intellectually, and we should adopt some of these ideas if they can be of intellectual, if they can give us intellectual insights. So this is a very important dimension of the ontological turn in anthropology, that the ideas of different cultures become sources of anthropological theory. And another important figure in the ontological turn is Bruno Latour, and many of his ideas kind of really create almost an equivalency between some of the most so-called primitive cultures, such as animism and so on, with humans' relationships with technology. Um, and Bruno Latour says, well, he has a whole a book and a whole intellectual agenda, we could say, which shows that actually we have never been modern. So again, similar maybe to Levi-Strauss, the non-modern is really an integral part of our life. We've never been completely modern, and we should accept that. So in anthropology, there has been then this shift from the racism of the origins of anthropology going completely in the other to the other side now, where we take different cultures very seriously. We respect them, we learn from them, and we even take them as our intellectual equals. Now, there's a real implication there. And I don't think that most anthropologists, or I think anthropology has not really fully taken the measure of that implication, which is that all of these cultures, except for the modern West, are non-secular. In other words, they have ontologies which are non-materialist, in which there are spiritual beings and their spiritual powers. And so if we really want to take them seriously, if we want to overcome the racism inherent to the origins of anthropology, then we have to take seriously the spiritual ideas, the non-secular ideas and ontologies of these different societies. And if we don't do that, if we say, oh, well, yeah, I can really respect those people who who consider that trees have spirits or that animals have spirits. That's very nice. I can describe that. I respect that, but I have but those ideas are only of any interest within that particular culture. Then I don't think I think we're still maintaining that that ethnocentrism, which is what anthropology is trying to transcend. So spirituality as method in the anthropological tradition means, okay, well, what are people doing in different cultures to deal with the spiritual dimension of the world? And well, what can we learn from that? So I think there are very profound implications here. And so this is one thing that I want to explore. Now, okay, now let me move to the sociological tradition. Now, the sociological tradition has not been focused on studying non-Western cultures. It has been focused on modern cultures and cultures in the process of modernization. But in fact, I will argue that the critical foundations of sociology are inseparable from a spiritual methodology. And again, I think the implications of this really need to be thought about more clearly in sociology. So let's look at some of the towering figures of sociology. So we'll start with Karl Marx. So Marxism is really based on an analysis of the structures of society, a critical analysis of the structure of society, and this critical analysis aims at creating the conditions for the liberation of humanity from oppression. And this liberation of humanity from oppression leading to a future vision of communism. Now, Marxism claims to be materialist, but the vision that underlies the critique is actually a spiritual vision. In other words, a vision of a world in which everybody is equal, in which everybody is loving and compassionate to each other, in which everyone is close to each other, in which they care for each other, in which there's no oppression, in which there's no injustice, in which there's no exploitation. This world has never existed in the material world. It's it's an imagination. It's an imagination of an ideal which actually is derived from religious visions of heaven on earth, religious visions of, or even of life in heaven. And it is that that spiritual yearning for an ideal world which motivates people to try to strive for that ideal world and to try to build that ideal world. And locating themselves within that imagination of an ideal world, then you can turn back, look at the material world as it is today, and criticize it, critique the injustice that exists in the structures of society. So, my argument is that Marx or Marxism is rooted in a spiritual yearning, in a spiritual yearning. Now then, let's look at our great founding figure number 2, Max Weber. And actually, Max Weber, what he was actually trying to do was a comparative sociology of spirituality, religion, and social change. So his famous work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, is really a study of Protestant spirituality. And how does Protestant spirituality, or a certain form of Protestant spirituality, lead people to act in a distinct way? And so all of these ideas that Weber talked about this worldly asceticism, otherworldly asceticism. So these are different forms of spirituality. And so and Weber looked at Protestantism, he looked at China, he looked at India. And so in each of these studies that he conducted, he really looked at how do people's spiritual ideas and dispositions lead them to lead their lives differently, lead them to live in society differently, and thereby actually creating very different types of societies. And he also talked about the relationship between right, what he called, let's say, the Protestant ethic, or the ethic of different cultures, which is really a form of spirituality. What's the relationship between that and institutional religion? How do religions emerge out of this, and how do they transform spirituality, and so on? So Weber's work is actually very much can be reread as a study of spirituality and in its relationships with society. Now, then, if we look at Durkheim, of course, in the Durkheimian tradition, and I would really associate myself with the Durkheimian tradition more than any other. Durkheim really looks at the religious and sacred foundations of society in his book, The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life. So for him, society comes into being as society in ritual, in religion. And this is not only the case in societies that consider themselves to be religious, but all societies, including modern society. And so if we want to understand life in society, we have to understand religious life, the spiritual life. And Durkheim even wondered how the future of society would evolve. And what's really interesting is that he started talking about the religion of the human being, where as humanity in the modern world becomes more and more cosmopolitan, then there would be a kind of religion of a cosmopolitan humanity. So this part of Durkheim's thought has not been as well developed, but for Durkheim, or in a Durkheimian sociological tradition, one cannot avoid thinking about what is the religious dimension of how society is constructing itself today. Now let's go to one of the more recent great figures of sociology, actually a philosopher, but now considered one of the greatest theoreticians in sociology, is Michel Foucault. And what's interesting here is Foucault was actually perhaps one of the greatest theoreticians of spirituality. In his books on sexuality, he developed the notion of the care of the self, it's really a study of Greek spirituality. And in his later books, which have only recently been translated into English, which are on the hermeneutics of the self, there's a very explicit, a very detailed study of Greek spirituality. And Foucault defines spirituality as a form of knowledge in which knowing requires you to change yourself. And Foucault, we could see toward the end of his life, was increasingly interested in this. And he wasn't studying it only as an external observer, but we could see that he increasingly advocated this kind of Greek, I mean, he saw it as an aesthetic construction of your life. But he really, he was investigating what we would call, but in fact, he also called spirituality among the Greeks. So I want to look a little bit more into these spiritual undercurrents that underlie much of sociological theory. Now, there are also some implications here. Critical sociology, what defines critical sociology is that it critically unpacks the way society has been constructed and the oppressive and unjust ways in which society has been constructed. But from which position can we take such a critical perspective? You can only take such a critical perspective from a position of an imaginary, non-oppressive society. From an imaginary human being who does not oppress others, who does not dominate others. So, who is this imaginary human being? So this is a just human being. This is a compassionate human being. This is a loving human being. This is a human being who wants to create a better world. Well, where do we find, what are the sources of this justice, this love, and this compassion? And here's where I think we need to start asking ourselves spiritual questions. What is the source of the alternative to an unjust, dominating social structure? Now then we have two choices. Either we claim that human beings are only and always dominating and oppressive, and in which case our critical analysis is disempowering because we constantly assert that the contest for power is the only way in which human beings can behave. So our critique is actually reinforcing the structures of domination, because we're telling people that you cannot be other than a domineering animal, an oppressive animal. Or, so that's choice number one. Choice number two is to say, we have these dominating structures in society, but as human beings, we're capable of something different. Well, what's the source of that capability? Is the source in the dominating structure of society, or is it somewhere else? And this is a very fundamental question for sociology, for critical sociology. So, taking a sociological or a critical sociological anthropological perspective, then, looking at spirituality, we look at spirituality as something that is social. That means that it's something that's transformed by social life, and it's the means by which we can transform social life. So this is very different from very individualistic understandings of spirituality. And the other thing that's very important, though, is that spirituality can only be learned through a combination of theory and practice. So as Foucault himself said, spirituality is knowledge that can only be gained through the transformation of the knower. So here's where we, and this is why it's important methodologically that an investigation of spirituality should be one of participant observation, let's say, to take an anthropological methodology. You need to participate, you need to practice, because only through the practice can you gain the knowledge. So this is an approach to spirituality which is rooted in social theory, sociological and anthropological theory, but which is also enriched and rooted in a practice. So how does that work? Well, this is, in a sense, this course is part of an exploration and an experimentation of where that would go. So that was this presentation that I wanted to make on a practical and socially engaged approach to spirituality, which is grounded in critical anthropological and sociological knowledge. Thank you. Okay, so that was the first talk. And is everybody still there? Yeah? Okay. Now, okay, let's take a 5-minute break because I have the second talk, which is on operating systems, okay? So, yeah. Or if you have any questions, I mean, we can actually have a bit of a Q&A as well, or a discussion. Yeah, that would actually be good. It would be very helpful as well. If you have any, so let's maybe just do a bit of discussion and then have a bit of a break and then go on to the next one. The next one probably won't be as long. Yeah.
You hear me?
Yeah, I hear you. Oh, Martin, you're there too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, it's getting more and more difficult than any previous round.
It's too difficult?
Yeah, it's very difficult, actually.
Yeah, well, this series, I'm just doing it directly. I mean, what I mean is, I'm not, so I did, the A series is for the student just to, practice, to learn and to practice. But this series is that to be honest, it's more for the reviewers. Anybody who wants to know what is this David Palmer doing? This weird. Okay, well, no. I'm ready to engage on the highest theoretical level here. That's really what this is about. It's the justification. But I mean, it's not just the justification. What I want to do is that I do want to engage I want to engage in that in the intellectual. I want to intellectually engage. I don't want to just do my own thing and then I want to go back and contribute to the intellectual debate. And so eventually this will become a publication of some sort, right? Yeah.
So if I pretend to be someone who knows the theory, actually,
yeah.
Actually, it's like for the students of every line of school you mentioned, Marxist, Durkheimian, Weberian, and even Foucault and critical sociologists Bourdieu, even Latour, they would have something arguing against the concept of spiritual already.
Sure.
Yeah. so Marxist is obvious because you are using the spiritual to challenge that the conclusion Marx made is actually something against what he is postulating throughout the history. For example, determined by material, determined by means of production, and how we predict residual values. This is all against the conclusion of getting to a communist reality. Or utopia mind. And you claim this conclusion spiritual, and this is something that really Marxists would first ask, does spiritual exist? Can you prove it? And second, how deep it influences people? And third, Marxists having based on the economic foundation, how can you alter this kind of prediction, material prediction by spiritual? Given that Marxist is saying the communist reality to be achieved could be made by material means, could be made by revolution, by the proletariat joining hands together it's the economic rationality, already the first thing. And then if you go towards, for example, Latour, he would come out and say, okay, we have already deconstructed the concept of social already, but now you add one more thing, spiritual here. And he would ask, are you using spiritual, the term, to designate very steady, stable material, or are you designating to designating some kind of assembling process? Is it a kind of thing that you are referring to a kind of agency behind people, something that moderates states of affairs? Or are you meaning other things like actually the more superficial physical figuration, this kind of thing? So it first comes out what do you designate? Is a fluid thing, assembling thing, or a concrete thing? I think people would go on and on, like Weberian is enchantment, but you are reviving the spiritual inside. So are you using the spiritual to are you using a different term to mention the same thing that has already been argued by Weber? For example, the capacity of changing the legal rational order termed as charisma, or other thing else, really I think would be very intensive if
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, this is a huge for each of these theoreticians. They need to be reinterpreted, okay? But I mean, actually the Marxist one for me is the easiest one, because if you take a purely materialist approach, you can't change anything. Because the Marxist view, the orthodox Marxist view, is that the consciousness is a reflection of the material world. Well, the material world is bad, so then where does it come from that you want to change the material world? I mean, your imagination of a better world is not a material thing. And if you have the power to be motivated to do something to change it, that power of motivation doesn't come from the material world. It comes from something else. So yeah, so where does it come from? I mean, people have power to improve, on the one hand, people have motivation to improve their own personal life. But if they want to create a world that is better, not just for themselves individually, but that is better for everyone, well, where does that vision come from? And where does the power to do something for that vision come from? Well, it doesn't even exist. It actually doesn't exist. So actually Marxism is about following something that doesn't exist, that is immaterial. So, I mean, for me, actually, it's most obvious, the Marxist one. And as for Weber, well, the interesting thing about Weber is that, there's this kind of the disenchantment, you know, right, the iron cage. So Weber really was very much into the rationalization and the iron cage idea. And there's this kind of this, but there's, in Weber, there is this pessimism. You know, the world is becoming so this iron cage, and it's as if there's nothing you could do about it. Well, is it true there's nothing you can do about it? So in that sense, Weber is the least spiritual of them all, because he, but again, the thing is, though, his the kind of the negative, the, how could I say, the pessimism that exists in Weber, right? The pessimism that exists in Weber, the sense of disappointment, you know, the iron cage is not a beautiful metaphor, right? It's a negative metaphor. Well, why don't you like it? Why don't you like this metaphor? You don't like it because there's something else that you really like. There's something else that you wish were not like an iron cage. Well, what is it? So why is it? Who is to say? I mean, modern people, they believe in freedom. They believe that you can create your own world. Well, who's to say then that you're not allowed to create a world that is not an iron cage? So that's Weber. Now, actually, Bruno Latour, though, is very interesting, because he's the one who really also said there's no division between science and religion. We've never been modern, and we you know, and the division between science and religion is an artificial one. And Latour himself said that, I mean, in his book, Reassembling the Social, he said we should take literally the claims of the old lady who claims that God is talking to her. We should take her claims absolutely literally. So Latour is, so I follow him totally. So let's take these religious claims absolutely literally and see where they take us. Yeah. So, but then all of these, the questions that arise, though, they also lead to the key question is, how do we define spirituality? And so that's, that is something that I discuss in other parts of the other videos of the first week, and in the next theoretical talk, or T3 is actually what exactly do I mean by spirituality? And I'm going to propose a pretty clear, well, I already did, a pretty clear definition of what is meant by spirituality. So that can help to clear out some of the issues. Yeah.
Well, actually, I really like the way Professor Palmer, like we read or we interpret, like the way we try to like associate how all these kind of great thinkers like to those the spiritual issues, even though, as Martin said, like perhaps from many kind of common way of reading is like we tend to trying to see that maybe they are largely like anti-spiritual to some degree, but talking about all the sociologists, like in the previous years I tutored courses on classical social theory. Actually, I got a very similar rates of readings on like all this Karl Marx, like Weber, like as Professor Palmer did. Like for instance, like when I read Karl Marx, like when he talked about all this issue of alienations, and I really got a sense that he got a very specific way of thinking of human nature, something that is more preferable or more normal. And that's why that's something that he understood, that in the factory system, all the things got alienated. It's very deviated from a certain understanding on human nature, Karl Marx proceeds. And also like talk about Weber's, and I think like definitely he is largely like pessimistic on all this iron cage kind of stuff. And when I read some of his writing on charisma, it seems that he got some sort of uneasy hope like on that, like
Yeah.
coming up with this.
That's
I think
right.
exactly that's some sort of like spiritual, something beyond that material world is very pessimistic, but there's something still the last hope. Yeah, yeah. I think so. When I do all these readings, I always find that like that's also affect the way I present my no matter MPhil thesis and PhD thesis, I always start with all these early thinkers. I always find that they are always related to religion. Well, that is just something on my own
Yeah.
ways of reading. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. So, is this still being recorded?
Yes, it is
So,
recording.
okay, good, good, good. All right. Because we could keep these this discussion as well as part of the recording. All right. Anything else? Joyce, do you have any thoughts?
No, I just really agree with Steve how it's a really fresh way of relooking at these very classical theories, and especially when I was so influenced by Marxism when I just got into Hong Kong U. And I think it's really a great way of paving the students into a deeper theoretical discussions and why we are doing the action series and the theory series separately.
Right.
So it's
Right.
very great.
Okay, so let's take a break. Let's take a 5-minute break, and then I'll do the next talk. Yeah.